Today on the podcast, we head to Kentucky for an engaging chat about soil with market gardener, farm journalist, and podcaster Jesse Frost. He's the host of the No-Till Market Garden podcast, and he and his wife are no-till farmers at their Rough Draft Farmstead. Jesse's also the author of a new book, The Living Soil Handbook. The Food Garden Life podcast today is a rebroadcast of the radio show that aired live on July the 7th.
Welcome to the Food Garden Life Show with your hosts Emma and Stephen Biggs, right here on Reality Radio 101. You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show with your hosts Emma and Stephen Biggs. We talk to creative food gardeners and food garden experts who break the rules and make new ones. Emma Biggs is a popular speaker, and she's only 16. Emma is the author of Gardening with Emma. Stephen Biggs is the author of the Canadian bestseller, No Guff Vegetable Gardening, the award-winning Grow Figs Where You Think You Can't, and Grow Lemons Where You Think You Can't, and Growing Figs in Cold Climates, 150 of your questions answered. Now, here are your hosts, the daughter and father duo, Emma Biggs and Stephen Biggs.
Hey everyone, I'm Emma Biggs and thanks for hanging out with us today on the Food Garden Life Show. I'm a 16-year-old Gen Z gardener, author, speaker, and blogger, and my passion is growing tomatoes, trying new unusual crops, and saving seed.
Hey everyone, I'm Stephen Biggs, food gardening guy, horticulturist, author, and horticultural journalist. And we think that growing and cooking together grounds people, strengthens families, and builds communities. And our goal is to inspire and inform with stories and ideas about gardening, food, and people.
We give gardeners permission and confidence to challenge the rules because we can all make a difference in the world, and what we eat and what we grow is one way that we can all make a difference.
I was out in the garden yanking weeds last night. Weeds that were bigger than I'm proud of. They seemed to leap out of the ground while we were away camping a few days ago. Don't let those sow thistles and lamb's quarters go to seed, I was telling myself, or you'll be digging out even more of them next year. But of course, the soil is full of weed seeds already. And when I dig that soil, I'm giving those seeds an opportunity to grow. So there will be lots of thistles and lamb's quarters next year anyway, despite my weeding. I garden on heavy yellow clay here in Toronto, and when I see it packed down, my garden fork beckons me. I want to disturb it. I want to loosen it up, even though I know that digging changes the soil structure, and that when I dig, organic matter that's brought to the surface will break down more quickly. So how does a gardener find that sweet spot between digging and not digging? And what do we mean by no-till or no-dig in a garden setting?
So if you've ever thought about just how much digging is the right amount, maybe using no-till practices or just reducing the amount of tilling in your garden, our guest today is going to help you think about the most appropriate approach for your garden. Jesse Frost is a market gardener, journalist, and the host of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. He and his wife are no-till farmers at the Rough Draft Farmstead in Kentucky, and Jesse is also the co-founder of no-tillgrowers.com, an information hub with no-till insights from growers in North America and Europe, and he has a fantastic new book called The Living Soil Handbook.
Today in our tomato segment, Emma talks no-till tomatoes with Jesse because tomatoes are one of the 7 start-to-finish no-till crops that he covers in the Living Soil Handbook. The fig segment is on vacation this month, but on the subject of figs, if you're looking for a gift for a would-be fig grower in your life, I've just bundled up my 2 fig books, and you can save $5 when you order them together. Just look for the fig book combo on the shop page at foodgardenlife.com. If you have a fig or a tomato question, by the way, just email us now and we will dig into them later in the show. So get on board now if you have questions for Jesse, if you have tomato questions, comments, or just to give us a shout out to say hello. The studio email address is instudio101@gmail.com.
And before we get to our guest, how are you doing? I am so happy because school is done. School is out for the summer, and it's going to be a great summer filled with lots and lots of gardening and tomatoes. And we celebrated by taking a nice little canoe trip to Algonquin Park here in Ontario. My brothers caught some fish, and I was lying in the hammock reading some novels and also a couple plant breeding books. So I'm pretty happy about that.
I really enjoyed the camping trip with the kids. They're big enough now that they can help me set up camp while I hang the food. And we hang the food in a tree so that it's out of reach of bears. And when you have to hang the food, weight really becomes a big consideration. So I pack dry foods. And it is really the antithesis of fresh garden fare, but I think I'm getting pretty decent at cooking up good meals from dry ingredients on our little camp stove.
Yeah, I mean, whenever we go camping, I sure miss all the fresh tomatoes and everything out of the garden, but we come home and it's always a treat. We came home on Monday and it was so nice to walk in the garden. I had my very first fresh tomato and the peppers are coming along. I ate my first ground cherry. So it's always special coming back and seeing the garden. Now, between shows, we'd love it if you kept in touch with us and we want to hear what you think. You can always message us at foodgardenlife.com. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we hang out under the handle Food Garden Life. And I also hang out on Instagram as @EmmaBiggs_grows. And my website is emmabiggs.ca.
And don't forget to tune in to our weekly podcasts on foodgardenlife.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And some of the fun topics that we've covered since the last live radio show, we talked to ecological gardener Matt Rees-Warren in the UK, and he told us about coppicing, alcoholic hedgerows, about scythes, and layering a hedgerow using pleachers. And Chef Alan Burgo talked to us about cooking often forgotten plant parts like squash vine tips and carrot leaves.
And we also had physiotherapist Nancy Durant tell us about the gardens and avid gardeners at a Toronto long-term care home where she works, because they grow foods and the residents are mostly in their 90s. And she said, quote, "I can't hold them back sometimes." So that was a lot of fun. And we also talked to some friends at Black Creek Community Farm, and we heard about this very unique urban space, which includes a market garden, a food forest, greenhouse, which I'm so excited about, an outdoor classroom, an outdoor brick pizza oven, medicine wheel garden, mushroom garden, chicken coop, beehives, and so much more. So I'm thinking, Dad, we have to go and check it out in person sometime soon.
Yeah, it sounds like a great space. Well, quickly, some shout outs to our listeners today, and thanks for your messages. We really appreciate them. So to Joe, Kelly, and Nan, who checked in about the pictures of pawpaw flowers that we shared on social media, thank you. To Dwayne for writing in to say you're enjoying the show. To Carla in Syracuse, New York, glad you're enjoying the show, and really glad that you had a giggle from that illustration of a worm sitting on a toilet that was in my book, No Guff Vegetable Gardening. And Bill, we're glad you enjoyed the show with Alan Burgo about root to flower gardening.
And Brenda said that she liked the ice cubes with pansy flowers that I made, which she saw on the Food Garden Life Instagram page. And Joyce, thanks for tuning in from Kingston. And Scene, thank you, and I'm glad that you enjoyed the garlic episode with Doug Oster.
Okay, well, back to today's show. Our theme today is soil, and our guest is Jesse Frost, who is passionate about protecting living soil. He's a market gardener, journalist, and the host of the No-Till Market Garden podcast, and he and his wife are no-till farmers at their Rough Draft Farmstead in Kentucky. His new book is The Living Soil Handbook, and you can find Jesse online at no-tillgrowers.com.
And remember that we post the contact information in the show notes, which go up on the website foodgardenlife.com the day after the show. And so we're going to jump right into it, but make sure that during the show you send in all your questions, comments, or ideas to instudio101@gmail.com.
And without further ado, let's bring Jesse on the line. Jesse, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. And maybe we could start out just quickly by your journey into farming, and how did you get where you're at on Rough Draft Farmstead in Kentucky?
Yeah. So it's, I didn't have an agricultural background like many people who kind of joined the small farming movement in the late aughts. And so I was at the time working in wine and wine sales in New York City. And we specialized in very small production wines. And I got very interested in the agriculture behind those wines. I got interested in biodynamic wines. And I just found that those wines spoke to me viscerally. I felt that there was a different flavor and a different quality to them that I couldn't really put a finger on. So I started to visit those producers. And many of those producers in Europe, specifically in France and Austria. And I was really taken by these farmers, these viticulturists, and how they were so dedicated to the soil. And I knew that I didn't really want to be a wine producer, but I knew immediately after visiting these farmers that I wanted to grow food and that I wanted to have something to do with agriculture. So I was getting a little bit exhausted with New York City. It's a very busy place and it can take a toll on you. And I decided to move back to where I grew up in Kentucky and get a job on a farm. And so I found an internship in Southern Kentucky, and I found a small biodynamic farm that was specializing in vegetables, but also had mushrooms and pigs and turkeys, and did rotational grazing. And it was just a perfect immersion into all things agriculture for me to get a taste of everything and kind of pick and choose what I liked. So that's where it started. That was my first foray into agriculture. It was very difficult, and it was also very rewarding. By the end of the season, I could not imagine doing anything else. And so I decided to come back for a second season. And I did a second year interning there and apprenticing, and met my wife that year. And my wife was the other apprentice, and we hit it off. And then long story short, we started a farm, and we called that one Rough Draft Farmstead. And that was back where we both grew up in central Kentucky. And then we moved several times. So Rough Draft became a very appropriate name for us. And we ultimately wound up in central Kentucky again, in a place called Lawrenceburg. And that's where we reside now. And I think we're on our fifth farm, but I also think we are on our last farm. We really love this new location. We're close to Lexington. If anyone's familiar with Kentucky, there are two big cities here, Lexington and Louisville, and we're almost equidistant to the two. So Lexington is our main market. Yep. And that's where we sell the majority of our produce.
Wow. So from wine into farming onto your fifth farm. And I should also mention to listeners that you weave journalism in with what you do too. Tell us just quickly about that.
Well, I'm a frustratingly curious person sometimes, and I really have always loved journalism. I have a great deal of respect for journalists and their ability to just ask questions and really dive into issues. And I've done journalism on and off for many years, and I've written for Civil Eats and Modern Farmer and The Atlantic and a couple others, and really loved that. And I loved exploring. There's just something really beautiful about the idea, especially when you're writing about science, which is what I was mostly writing about, of calling somebody who spent their entire lives dedicated to the one question you have to make sure your sentence is correct. And there's just, you end up in these sometimes long conversations with people who've really dedicated to certain things. And that is really exciting for me. And I think honestly, that kind of I fulfill that a little bit now with the podcast.
And I guess today we get to talk to you all about no-till gardening and farming and practices around that. So we're kind of doing the same thing.
We're in the same shoes.
That's great.
So you're doing no-till farming now, but What was the farm like before you started no-till farming?
Yeah, so I've had kind of a journey through from tillage to no tillage, and it started at my internship at Buck Tussle Farm in southern Kentucky, and they were a very responsible tillage farm. They used a lot of cover crops. We used biodynamic preparations, but we did rely on tillage as our primary soil preparation method. And I learned a lot in that experience. I learned how to do it right and do it well, without, keeping your soil in place as best you could under those circumstances. And we did a lot of row cropping, and my farm now looks very different from that. It took several years of practice and trial and error, and trying different things and different techniques and different mulches to get to the point that we are now. But we started small and we trialed different things until it kind of clicked together. And now we have a good system. It's always something that we're trying to improve upon. But yeah, I'm happy to give you more details on no-till as you'd like.
Yeah, well, I also want to know, when did you hear about no-till and why did it interest you, and why is it something that kind of stuck with you and became what you did at your farm?
That's a great question. So when we first started off on our own, we were running into issues that we hadn't had on the other farm during our internship. And those are, disease issues or poor quality crops or just weeds. Just the amount of time we would spend tackling weeds was a lot. And we were having trouble figuring out how to make that a viable business. And just because of the amount of time it took to just get a crop to market, and deal with the weeds, it was too much. And it became something where we wanted to investigate how to deal with that. And so we started reading a lot of different books, and there wasn't a lot on our scale. There was a lot of information about larger scale no-till with cover crops. There was a lot of information about no-till, as a lot of people know it, with chemicals, where you grow a cover crop or you spray down weeds with some sort of herbicide, and then you plant into that. So there was those two things. There was kind of the larger scale, and then there was the sort of more backyard stuff, which is great too, but there wasn't much for our scale of, roughly an acre. And so that's when we started to kind of look at different ideas, and we came across conservation agriculture, which kind of is based around three principles of keeping the soil. Well, four principles, depending on how you put them together. But it's keeping the soil covered as much as possible, keeping it planted as much as possible, with a diversity of crops. That's the fourth one, and then disturbing it as little as possible. And that sort of became the backbone of what we think of as no-till. And those three principles, however, when I was looking for information on how those function together and how to kind of accomplish them on a technical level, I ran into a lot of issues finding any information about how to do it. Like I said, there was a lot of information for the bigger scale, a lot of information for the smaller scale, but I couldn't find anything that said, this is how you do this on a small scale. And so that's really what's, sparked me to keep trialing stuff and figure it out. And then also to start the podcast and start asking other people what they were figuring out. And from that, we've discovered a lot of different techniques. I think one thing about gardening that's different from a lot of different forms of agriculture is that it's very site specific. It's very context specific. So figuring out how to do different no-till techniques in more and more context was also important. Finding, what works in California doesn't always necessarily work in Kentucky. And so we had to do a lot of investigating and talk to a lot of different people, read a lot of, I've, especially during the research for the book, I read a lot of different scientific papers and just tried to flesh that out as much as I possibly could to figure out, a more of a choose your own adventure approach to a farming book, where it's not just, this is what is and is not tillage, and this is exactly how to do it. It says, what is your context? This is how to figure out what your context is, and these are some ideas for that context. That was sort of my goal with the book, and to give it, instead of just being, this is how I do things on my farm, this is how soil works, and this is how you can maximize that. You can make it function the best for you and for the crops.
Okay. And so just to recap and make sure I got that properly, when we're talking about conservation agriculture, there's the idea of minimizing soil disturbance, keeping it covered as much as possible, and then keeping it planted as much as possible. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. And those are the three principles that I sort of based the book around. And then the fourth one is keeping as much biodiversity in there as possible as well. And I, in my book, kind of include that in keeping it planted as much as possible, because those two certainly go hand in hand.
I think something that really jumped out to me is, as I was looking through your new book, The Living Soil Handbook, before we got on here, is the fact that you're farming, but we're me and Dad are just small scale gardening, and I can still apply it to what we're doing here. And so I really love that too, as you have made it so flexible, so that farmers, I guess the main people that you're aiming the book at, but even people like Dad and I can garden and use those principles in our backyards.
Well, absolutely. And I really hope so, because one of the things that, our sort of agriculture focuses on, we're small scale biointensive is often the word that's applied. We're small scale biointensive, and that means that we're trying to maximize a small space too. Even though our small space is bigger than a lot of backyards, we're still approaching it the same way, that we're looking at, how to get as many crops into a small space as possible. And that also includes intercropping and what's called relay cropping, and trying to make sure that we're getting as much food out of a small space as possible. And I'm delighted to hear that it's applicable, because that was certainly a goal. I want this to be applicable to anybody on any scale.
Now, maybe if we could step back for a minute, and you were talking about how you went through lots of literature as you were putting together the book. And so, putting together all that information on soil, how would you give somebody who's new to soil the basics? What would be the basics of soil that you'd share with a newcomer to the science of soil?
The thing that I stress more than anything is get to know photosynthesis. This is as a grower, as a gardener, as a farmer, your job is to manage photosynthesis. And, for those who've kind of forgotten what this process is, we all learned it in high school or grade school, and it's not been something that's applicable to everybody their whole lives, but the photosynthesis is incredibly important. It cools our planet. It gives us oxygen to breathe. It puts carbon into the soil. It is an extraordinarily important process, and understanding how it works can enable you as the grower to kind of see what's going on with your plants and to maximize their growth and understand when something's going wrong. Like, you can kind of get an idea for what that is. So just a really quick basic rundown. Photosynthesis is the combination of sunlight, specifically photons from the sun, with water and carbon dioxide, and it makes essentially carbohydrates, glucose. And that's the building blocks of all life. Everything relies on photosynthesis. So, we humans don't think of ourselves maybe as relying super heavy on photosynthesis, but not only does it give us the oxygen to breathe, but all of our food comes from photosynthesis. Even the eggs of chickens who maybe dig a worm out of the soil, but that worm before the chicken got to it, had been feeding on microbes. And those microbes, before the worm got to it, had been feeding on even smaller microbes of bacteria and fungi. And then those bacteria and fungi, before the larger organisms got to it, had been feeding on plant roots, on photosynthesis. It's all, that's all extraordinarily important. Everything on the planet, every living organism, is reliant on photosynthesis. And that is, if we get a basic understanding for how that works, you can identify things like, when a plant, I can give an example from this season. We moved on to a new property. We had an area of our farm that I had not realized it was on a hillside, and I hadn't expected to have poor drainage on this spot. And I noticed early on that some plants were stunted. They weren't growing. And I've been doing this for long enough that I know, more or less how long a plant is supposed to take, even in a cold spring when it can be a little volatile. And I noticed that it just wasn't growing. These were lettuces, and I started to investigate a little further, and I realized that the soil was too wet, and it was not draining. And there are reasons for that I found out later. There's a drainage pipe that drains right into that plot, which was unfortunate. But what it told me was that the plant roots were unable to breathe. They were unable to pull the water up from the soil because it was too saturated. And when that happens, your plant will stop growing. If it's not growing, it's not photosynthesizing. And so that was just an easy clue for me, was that I could tell immediately, because the plant wasn't growing, that it wasn't able to draw water in. And so that got me investigating, and that's when I found the poor drainage, and ultimately was able to, I wasn't able to save that specific crop, but I was able to save the next crop by managing that poor drainage and managing the compaction that poor drainage has caused.
Okay, well, we have a great question in from Katie, who's asking, what is considered healthy soil, and how do you know if your soil is just that?
That's a great question. There's a lot of different ways to measure soil health, and I go back and forth on how analytic I want to get in terms of doing soil tests and those sorts of things. But I think a good soil test will help you. That'll tell you how much your soil organic matter is. And that's really the key. You want to see your soil organic matter kind of increasing to that 8% ish range at about 8 inches down. If you can get it there over several years, that's great. That's a really good, healthy soil. But another clue, there are a lot of biological clues, and not just in the plant production. Plant production is a good clue. If your plants are doing well, that's always a good clue. But things like earthworms, seeing the biology in the soil. Earthworms are an excellent indicator of soil health. You should have many, many worms in each handful of soil. If you can reach in and see, a significant worm population, that's a really good indicator of good, healthy soil. And if you don't see them, maybe something's off, and maybe that's worth addressing with cover crops are a great way to bring in worms. I know that's a little bit harder on a garden scale, on a backyard garden scale, but keeping crops planted all year is really good for that too. They like feeding on, like we said earlier, on microbes, and microbes love feeding on root exudates. The carbon that's coming through photosynthesis is coming out of the roots. Microbes love feeding on that. So if you have more plants growing, then you're going to attract more microbes, and then you're going to have more things like earthworms. And so that's I think those are two good indications of how your soil is doing and what healthy soil is. And also just the pliability, able to reach your hand into the soil. If you can kind of put your hand in and it feels smooth and it's easy to dip your hand in 6 or 8 inches. That's great. That means that the plant roots are going to be able to move around and the organisms are moving around. And both of those all of that can be great indications of good, healthy soil.
Okay. So Katie, lots of organic matter, lots of worms, and that it feels soft, I guess would be the descriptor there, maybe, Jesse, that you can get your hand right in there. Now, Katie had a second part to her question, just wondering about soil pH and checking it. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not super concerned with soil pH. Plants are able to sort of mitigate their soil pH to some extent with their root exudates. They can actually kind of manipulate the pH levels, and so can some of the microbes. I'm less concerned with that. I'm more concerned with the breaking up compaction. I think the bigger concerns are, things like compaction. If you have really compacted soil, like I said, if you're not able to dip your hand in the soil and kind of move it around fairly easily, that's going to mean your roots are not going to be able to either, and the earthworms are not going to be able to either. That's more concerning to me than pH. Now, there are extreme examples, right? There could be really acidic soils in certain climates and certain environments, or really alkaline soils. And those should be addressed. It's not something that you don't have to look at ever. But in general, if you feel good about your soil, if it's generally performing well, you can, pH is not as important to me as soil organic matter and as is microbial life. And I talk a lot about microbial life in the book. And one of the things that we do, a really simple technique for getting a lot of good microbial life, a good robust population of microbial life, is using vermicompost. This is, we use a lot of vermicompost on our farm, and essentially we just have one worm bin, and we, strain it every so often when it's full. And we use just a pinch of that mixture, that vermicast, as it's called, in some water, some non-chlorinated sort of rainwater is ideal. And then you mix that up. And then right before you plant your crops, you just let them soak up that mixture. So you set them in a bottom watering tray for us, or just a piece of plastic with some water in it that'll allow the bottoms of the plants, of the cell trays or whatever you're using, to soak that up. And then you can take that immediately out to the garden and plant it. And that gets that plant off to the right start with some good microbes. And that can be an instant boost for your crop.
Okay, excellent. And for listeners not sure about the term vermicompost, we're talking about worm poo. So now we had an email come in from Clyde, who says, what causes mold on and in soil? Is it dangerous to breathe the soil and mold while working with it? And he also adds, P.S. my vote is for the Biggs greenhouse. And Jesse, we have a friendly little rivalry going on here. Emma wants the greenhouse, so the pressure's on from her and the listeners. But back to the mold, how would you answer that?
Yeah, so generally speaking, visible mold in your garden, in your soil, is not a bad thing. Most molds, most fungi in general, what they're doing is they're processing organic matter. So the ones that you can see, there are two main types of fungi. There's the saprotrophic fungi. These are the ones that consume soil organic matter, that consume oftentimes like woody materials. They can break down lignin and all these materials that not a lot of organisms can access. And in so doing, they release those nutrients. So that's a lot of times why we use mulches, is they add soil organic matter, but they also add nutrients to the soil. And that's how they do it, is through fungi and molds and various other, fungal decomposers. And, and then the other type of fungi that's important, obviously, is and maybe not obvious, a lot of growers may not know about mycorrhizal fungi, but mycorrhizal fungi are also really important. And these are the ones that latch onto your plant roots. Maybe the listeners have heard about how forests can be, multiple trees can be latched on and connected to one organism, and that organism being the mycorrhizal fungi. One mycorrhizal fungi can latch onto several different kinds of trees and actually transport nutrients as needed between the trees. And it's an underground internet. It's a really extraordinary system. But those are the ones that you don't see as much. The ones that you do see tend to be those decomposers. And for the most part, they're not a problem. Obviously they can be, if you have a lot of mold and fungus right around the stem of a plant, around, when you're mulches. A lot of times when you're mulching, you're told to keep it away from the stem. And that's because if those fungi really build up right around the stem, they can kill plants. But generally speaking, seeing fungi, seeing molds in your garden is not necessarily a bad thing. There's some of those slime molds that are really, really beneficial, actually. Never assume they're a bad thing. Always assume that they're there for a reason, and that they're giving you more nutrients unless they start to affect your crops, and then you can reevaluate.
Okay, and I think it ties in with what you've been saying about having lots of microbial activity in general. That's what we're aiming for with healthy soil. I have a couple more emails I'd like to run through, and then we want to ask you about tillage specifically. But Joyce has written in from Queens, New York City, to say she loves the show and she really enjoyed a post that I put up online with kids in the mud, and maybe not related to today's theme, except kids playing in the soil. And I think, how wonderful is that? Get the kids started in the soil. We also have an email that came in from Pedro from Charlotte, North Carolina. And his question is that his property is mostly clay soil, and he's looking for suggestions to improve the soil for growing plants and veggies. And he says that he always ends up buying and adding bags of good topsoil, but that gets expensive. What thoughts would you have for Pedro, Jesse?
Yeah, absolutely. First, Joyce, I'm with you. Our children play in the soil constantly. It's very important for us. And then for Pedro, clay can be tough. Clay can be a really tough substance. And one of the things that I say that often surprises people is that if it's compacted, or if you're having trouble with it draining or growing crops very well, you may want to think about working some compost into that clay before you establish a sort of permanent bed system. So one of the main pillars of what we do in no-till is we keep our beds the same year after year in the same place. And the value of that is you can really work on that section, and you leave your pathways where you're always walking and compacting. You leave those separate from your beds where you don't walk and where you want it to be nice and loose and friable. So with something like clay, you may actually want to start by in a small backyard garden, maybe start by double digging it and getting some of that clay worked in there. And then after that, you may want to think about covering it with maybe some more compost. I generally like compost, but you can use a lot of different mulches. In North Carolina, you're in a subtropical environment, and you may want to think about having heat. The heat. So you may want to think about having like a cooler straw or something to keep the soil cool, especially during the hotter months. And that will help to, the microbes will start breaking that down and start working in the soil. But also you have that base with the compost worked in, and then you never really have to till that soil again. You never really have to work it again. We can talk about tillage, like you mentioned, we're going to talk about tillage and no tillage, but it's sometimes you have to approach your soil based on your context. That's more important for photosynthetic activity than just not tilling for not tilling's sake.
Okay. Excellent. And back to the context, which you started off with today. I have one comment too for Pedro. Here in Toronto, I'm gardening on heavy yellow clay. But I find that in the city here, most people put their leaves out to the curbside for municipal pickup in the fall. So there's a lot of opportunity to make a whole lot of excellent leaf compost, leaf mold that we can really lighten up our clay with. So.
Yeah, and we just had a great question in from Ron asking if our guest has a website. And yes, Jesse has a website. You can always find him at notillgrowers.com and everything that he's up to as well. Now, let's actually get to what we are trying to talk about. What is tillage?
Yeah, so, you can define tillage in many different ways. What I have tried to do is rein it in a little bit so that we have a very specific definition of it. I do this in the book of you can think of tillage as anything you do that causes long-term harm to the soil. This is the tiller itself can be it isn't necessarily the tool that you use, it's how you use it. So the tiller can be a really detrimental tool to the soil. It can break up soil aggregates. These are pieces of rock particles that microbes essentially glue together around pieces of carbon. And so when the tiller comes through the soil, it breaks up those soil aggregates and it injects a lot of oxygen into the soil so that oxygen-loving bacteria go bonkers, and they love to eat that newly freed up carbon. And so you deplete your carbon really quickly that way. And carbon is soil organic matter is extraordinarily important for soil health, because this is what a lot of your nutrition comes from. The plant's nutrition, a very heavy percentage of it comes from soil organic matter. So you don't want to lose that. You want to kind of retain that as much as possible. So those soil aggregates are really important. You don't want to break those apart. You don't want to rip apart those mycorrhizal fungi either. Those take a long time to establish. You want to keep them there as much as possible. So when we're talking about tillage, we're talking about things that cause compaction. For instance, the tiller does that as well. It causes compaction on the surface, and it causes compaction, especially if the soil is left bare, and also causes deep compaction. And what compaction does is it limits plant roots' ability to move. Right. Plant roots are not, especially in annual crops like what we grow with lettuces and tomatoes and et cetera. They're not the most robust roots. They're not tree roots. They're not going to break through compaction in 50 or 60 days. And also compaction, especially on the surface, limits gas exchange. Now, gas exchange is really important. This is where, microbes, when they're being consumed and when they're consuming, are also releasing carbon dioxide. And I know there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but plants really need that carbon dioxide coming up from the soil, because that's what they're going to use to kick off their photosynthesis. That's how it's called the carbon cycle, and it's extraordinarily important. So when we're doing things that cause compaction, that harm the soil repeatedly, that's more of a form of tillage than than disturbance. Disturbance is not necessarily a bad thing in every scenario, right? The disturbance is, historically, people disturb the soil in very small ways for a long time, and they actually were able to produce very biodiverse environments that way. I'm talking specifically about indigenous cultures. So we can't conflate the two, tillage and disturbance, because disturbance can be really beneficial. It can get your plants photosynthesizing in it really rapidly. And for instance, one of the abilities that humans have, that people have, that growers have, is that we can take a living plant and put it into the soil. So we can disturb the soil a little bit, get it a little bit ready sometimes. And I'm talking maybe a broad fork or a fork, just a light forking if the soil is compacted. And then we have the ability to immediately get a plant in there that's already photosynthesizing and ready to go. And nature can't really always do that on her own. And I think that that's something that we can embrace, and I give different techniques and different ideas around that. And I give a broader example of what, no tillage is and how to define tillage, and how to look at it. But I think instead of fixating too much on what is and isn't no-till, think about your soil and what it needs, and address that and do that for your plants. And it's definitely not turning it over all the time. It's not constant disturbance. But we can have beneficial disturbances, much like an earthworm can, or like microbes can, or like plant roots can. They are always disturbing the soil, and there's no reason that humans can't do that too.
Okay. But again, back to this idea of context, then, what you're doing in Kentucky might be quite different from what we're doing here in Toronto, for example.
Certainly. And what I'm doing on my plot may be different from what my neighbors are doing down the road, who maybe have more clay or less clay or more rocks or whatever it may be. Your context is really important. In fact, there's parts of my garden that I have to manage different than other parts just because of that drainage issue I mentioned earlier. So it's really about looking at the bed and looking at your plants and seeing how things are going, and also, kind of thinking about what you're doing to set the plant up for success. So when we're talking about earlier about microbes and in photosynthesis, you need to think about all those factors. It needs to have good water. Water is an essential part of everything. We look for water on other planets when we're searching for signs of life, right? So it's an essential part of life. And you need to make sure that the water is delivered well and at the right times and the right amounts. You need to think about carbon dioxide, which sounds strange, but we do. We need to think about those microbes. We need to make sure there's plenty of microbial activity. And we need to think about sunlight. Where's the sun coming from? Are they getting proper amounts? Is it adequate? Is there a lot of sun? Is it too intense? Is it too direct? When we're trying to grow lettuces out in a field, we do have to think about how the sunlight is hitting our plants, because lettuce is more of an understory crop. It wants a little bit of what we call diffuse light, of light that's bouncing off of other plants. That's kind of how it evolved. And so when we stick it out in a field that's just straight sunlight, it can be really hard on those crops. So those are the kind of things that we have to be thinking about.
Okay. Now, an email in from Susan asking, what is sterile soil that you buy at a garden center? Is it good to use? And I guess my response would be, I know certainly the seed starting soilless mixes that we get around here, they're often peat or coir based, and peat is fairly acidic, and so there's not much in the way of microbial activity in there, which a lot of people like for seed starting because there's less chance of damping off disease. So that would be my answer, Susan. Jesse, what would you say to Susan?
Yeah, I mean, for seed starting, you do often end up with somewhat sterile products, but you don't. I think ideally you're getting any sort of seed starting product from a professional who's really believes in what they're doing. You can get these in small amounts from really, look and see who the producers in your area are getting their compost and their soil mix from. Those to me are microbially rich, and they're not sterile, but they're going to produce really good crops because they were well produced with, a lot of times under a microscope. People are watching their biology and making sure it's the right biology. Your average sterile soil mix at a store, I don't necessarily believe is going to produce the same quality product as your, a well-produced soil mix. And then in terms of like raised, I feel the same way about things like raised bed mix. You want to get it from a producer who, when you call them, they are excited to talk about their product. That is the essence of, you're going to get something good when somebody gets really nerdy with you on the phone about what they do and what they produce.
Okay. Excellent. Now, Francis has written in asking if I order Jesse's and Stephen's books online, is there any way I can get them signed? I'm a collector of books and like a signature. Well, I can answer for myself. Francis, on foodgardenlife.com, all the books that I sell through there are signed. And Jesse, what about your book? If somebody wanted a signed copy, how would they get one?
Yes, if you go to no-tillgrowers.com and order the book from there, we will sign it. Absolutely. Or I will sign it.
Okay, now we had a question coming from Lenny saying, I'm contemplating purchasing a tiller for my large garden. I think he was asking about what type of tiller they should get, but I think we should change this question around a bit and talk about maybe why they should contemplate using a no-till method in their garden.
Yeah. And I will say, even if you just want to use it once or occasionally in a really responsible way, those are expensive, and it's maybe better to go in on a tool of any big time tool, especially if you're on a small scale, with somebody else, with a neighbor or with a friend, and see if you can split that cost. But generally, I think you should really look at your soil. You may not need to till it. One option, one basic no-till method is called the no-dig system, or what we call deep compost mulch here in the United States. And you're essentially putting a layer of cardboard down, and then you're covering that with several inches of compost, 6 or 8 inches. And then you're allowing that to break down for a small amount of time, maybe 3 or 4 months, depending on what time of year you're doing this. And then you're just putting crops right into that. And one of the benefits of that system, or of no-till in general, is that you're eliminating the weed potential. When you're constantly churning the soil over, you're bringing up new weed seed. You can kind of think about the soil like a battery, and it needs those living plants to charge it. The plants are photosynthesizing, charging this battery. But when you're tilling it, you're breaking apart all the infrastructure, and you're breaking apart those solar panels so that the soil throws up solar panels as quickly as it can. And that's what weeds are. Weeds are emergency solar panels for our soil battery, for the photosynthetic activity that we need, that we all rely on. So think of ways that you can manage the weeds with mulches. And, in the example I gave with the compost mulch, you'll produce an almost weed-free garden. You can grow exactly what you want. It'll grow really well because it'll be very nutrients. There will be if you get a decent compost, like I said, call a producer that you like, or that your farmer uses at the farmer's market, go talk to them. You'll get something, a really good compost, and you can plant into that. It may be an expensive upfront investment, but it'll last you, many years. You just top it off a little bit every year, and then you can use that. And that's such a simple method, and you can grow great produce, and weed-free great produce that way.
Okay. I love that. Weeds as an emergency solar panel. I haven't heard that before, but that strikes me. We have an email from Texas, and Eamon is just writing in to saying, I am for the Biggs greenhouse, as we have one. Love the show. Well, thank you, Eamon. That's wonderful. Now, we had wanted to leave time today to talk tomatoes, right, Emma? So I think
always.
You might want to take over the mic here.
Okay, well, Jesse, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about tomatoes because it's one of my favorite things to grow. So in the book, you have a section, actually you have 7 sections, focusing on some different crops and how you grow them at your farm. And one of those sections is all about cherry tomatoes. So why do you, with your focus at the farm and no-till growing, why do you grow cherry tomatoes?
Cherry tomato, yes, absolutely. I'm with you, Emma, on the tomato love. Cherry tomatoes in particular, they're a really good crop for us because we are primarily a farmer's market farm. And one of the things that other farmers in our area don't focus on as much is the small cherry tomatoes. They're more delicate. They are, they're very time consuming to pick. They can be somewhat perishable. So we decided when we looked around at our market that we wanted to focus on cherry tomatoes, but it also just so happens that I really love cherry tomatoes. I love eating them in salsas. I love, just eating them as a snack. They're one of my favorite field snacks when I'm in the garden. And so we focused heavily in on cherry tomatoes for that reason.
Well, I have to ask too. I think I asked this to everyone, but what are your favorite tomato varieties?
I've been saving seed on a black cherry tomato for, I want to say 9 or 10 years. And it's my favorite. It tastes a little bit, it has like a hint of cola, like it's a little bit like a soft drink. And it just has these really dark kind of cherry notes to it. And it's just always been one of my favorites. So I love that. I still love the classic Sun Gold cherry tomato. I also like this one called Blush that's more of a saladette. Maybe it's like a longer, and Bumblebee is another one that we really love. And then there's a couple hybrids that I actually really like that are, Sun Golds are a hybrid and so are Blush, but there's one that's like a tunnel tomato specifically. So if you do get your tunnel, is Super Sweet 100. It grows really well, and I love the flavor. It's just it's a really nice. It's got a great texture to it. It's really pretty red tomato that I've long enjoyed. So we always mix those together at our market, and there's like a nice little mixture of colors and sometimes shapes and sizes.
Nice. Well, Dad, remember that. So just so I can grow Super Sweet 100, we're going to have to get a greenhouse.
Another vote for the greenhouse.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I love black cherry too. It's another one of my favorites. And I've grown some of the Bumblebee tomatoes in a Blush as well. And they're all so good.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. In a tunnel, you get the benefit. You mentioned earlier that it was raining in Toronto your tunnel is going to help protect those tomatoes from splitting and from getting too wet and maybe, fungal moisture issues on your leaves, blight and that sort of thing. So yeah, if you're too, maybe the thing.
You heard that, Dad?
I heard it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm getting hungry talking about all these tomatoes. So one thing that you mentioned in the book is that you put in cover crops sometimes before your tomatoes. So let's talk a little bit about cover crops and then how they help with the tomatoes later on.
Yeah, especially for later season tomatoes, but you can do it for early season tomatoes as well. Cover crops are excellent. They're really good at feeding the soil over the winter when you're maybe not necessarily producing a crop, but you do still want something photosynthesizing. And so, you grow the cover crop. I really like rye and vetch. If you're doing one that you're going to have to terminate in the spring, you're going to have to crimp it and kill it before you plant. But that's a really good one. A lot of legumes in there too. So vetch is a legume. Crimson clover is another one. I think these would work in your climate still. Crimson clover is one that doesn't always overwinter, I think, that far north. However, there are also winter kill cover crops that die in the winter from the frost, from the freeze frost thaw cycles. And some of those would be like peas and oats. Oats doesn't reliably kill in our climate. It does sometimes, but it doesn't always. But peas are really great for that. So if you have, let's say that you get your crops out, your last crop that's going to be next year be tomatoes, provided you have a rotation down. So you would right now, for your climate, you'd probably sow it pretty soon. You'd sow a big, thick patch of peas or, anything that would die over winter. And you'd let that get really tall. And then the winter would kill it. And it would create like a light mulch on the surface. And in the spring, especially if you're in a tunnel, you do this pretty early. You pull the soil back and you put your crop in. And then there's no real tillage required. You can fertilize it a little bit. I often put, like I said, the same vermicompost. I mix that into a water solution and I dip the plants in that. But I also add a little compost to the hole where the tomato's going. That simplifies it. It gives you a little bit of a mulch for part of the season. You may still need to supplement a little bit. But either of those methods, they produce really good crops. And I think generally speaking, tomatoes do like to go into soil that is, is rich with those microbes and that has had, a lot of good photosynthesis going on over the winter.
Okay, well, you know what? I've had the gears spinning on cover crops for a little while now, so I'm thinking maybe we're gonna have to give it a try with some of my tomatoes this year.
Yeah, the one thing you have to think about with cover crops is just how you're going to terminate them. The winter, you have an advantage that I don't always have, and that's winter. We have winter, but we don't have the length and duration and the snow that you all have. So you may have some options in terms of what you can grow and what will die reliably there that we don't have. So yeah, I think if you have the space and you have the opportunity, playing around with some cover crops can be great, and they don't have to have a clear bed to go into. So in the fall, maybe you have some brassicas, some broccoli and cauliflower. You can, while those are growing, you could sow your cover crop underneath and let it start to take hold. Once you clear your cauliflower, your broccoli, your Brussels sprouts, from underneath, you'll get that crop growing up, and then it will take over the bed over the winter time. Then in the spring, you terminate it. And I give some options for how to terminate different kinds of cover crops in the book. And then then you can plant into that. And it's a great option.
Okay. Now, something else I want to touch on is about training tomatoes, because I know I get a ton of questions on this because there are so many ways to do it. And I know everyone's situation is different, but how do you train your tomatoes?
Sometimes it depends on the amount of space that I have. But I really like what's called the double leader system. And so this is, you have a single tomato plant and you plant that down the middle of a bed. And then you take one of the suckers and the main stem and you take those off in different directions. You create a V with the plant and you train those up a string and towards a wire. In our case, we're often doing this indoors. I have different ways for doing it outdoors, but then you train those up a wire. And what we do is we do what's called a lean and lower system, where once it gets to the top of that wire, once it gets to the top of your string to where the wire to what it's hanging on, we lower it and we lean it over so that it starts to, it's kind of hard to visualize, but it starts to lean, and you lean each side of the tomato in opposite directions and it goes around in a big circle. It's a little bit hard to explain without visuals, but the idea is that you are taking two stems off of the same plant, and those are essentially acting as two different tomato plants. The advantage is that you have a lot of space underneath of the plants. We use 4-foot beds, or beds are 4 foot wide. So we have a lot of space underneath of the plants that we can keep crops going in and out for the whole season. So we can do a round of lettuce, and then we can do, next to the tomatoes, and then we can do a round of beets, and then we can do a round of green onions. And we can do that throughout the season. So we're getting multiple crops out of those beds without wasting that space, without letting that space go.
So you get even more, you get lots of tomatoes and lots of everything you grow underneath. And then I guess you follow one of the principles, which is just keeping the soil covered as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to keep a good mulch on it, and you want to keep it covered with plants and a diversity of plants. Each plant has its own specialties. They draw in their own specific microbes and they add their own specific kinds of exudates to the soil, their own, that it's something that has been shown to be beneficial, is to have, a good diversity of crops in your soil. And sometimes we have beds with 4 different crops in them at the same time from 4 different crop families. And we figured out ways to do that on a production scale, but on a backyard scale, that might be ideal so that you're not, because you probably don't need 500 fennel.
Yeah, not quite.
It's a lot to eat. That's a lot of fennel salad. But that for us is important, but you can maybe grow 2 fennel, and you can grow a couple celery, and you can grow some lettuce underneath, and then you can get a round of beets in there. You could do all sorts of stuff in a very small space by just, not thinking too much about having just one crop per space, but trying to think about how you can maximize the length of time it takes to grow like a celery or a fennel. And then crops like radishes that are very fast, you can get those in and out really quickly before the fennel takes over the bed, or the fennel can be tough because I don't know why I'm using that as an example, except for that I love fennel, but it can be kind of an ornery crop. But, something like tomatoes, you can get radishes in, and beets and lettuce and all these other things.
Okay. Well, Jesse, thank you for all of your tomato wisdom. I'm excited to apply lots of it into my own garden. Now, before we wrap up, I think you have to let our listeners know how they can get more from you and your podcast and your books, and where they can find you online.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. And I'm excited to say that, that this has been great. So if you would like to follow our work or my work, you can go to no-tillgrowers.com. That is the main hub for all of our information. We do several different kinds of podcasts, from the No-Till Flowers podcast for flower producers. We do collaborative farming podcast for farm collaborations, and winter growers podcast for winter growers, and then the No-Till Market Garden podcast, and also a live show on every other Tuesday that is hosted on our YouTube channel by Josh Satin. And it's we do a mixture of different options, and we're always trying to aggregate as much information as possible, but that's the best place to find us.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, Jesse.
Thanks, Jesse. Been really great to chat with you.
And the pleasure has been all mine. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
okay,
Jesse.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, that was Jesse Frost, the author of the Living Soil Handbook, and that was sure a fun chat. And I guess as we wrap up today, as I mentioned, the fig segment is on vacation this month, but if you're thinking about figs, if you have figs on the brain, I'd have just put up on the website a bundle of my 2 fig books, and you can save $5 when you get them together. So if you just go to the shop on foodgardenlife.com, you can find it there.
Yeah, well, that was a lot of fun. It was awesome talking to Jesse, and I know I learned so much, and I love looking through his books, so I highly encourage everyone listening to go and check it out. Now, the Food Garden Life show is just about over for today, so a huge thanks to Jesse Frost for joining us on the show, and of course, to our fantastic producer, Gary, who makes the first Wednesday of every month so much fun. So thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Emma.
Okay, and thanks to Katie and Clyde and Joyce and Pedro, Ron, Susan, Francis, Lenny, and Eamon. We appreciate your questions and your comments and all those gentle nudges for me to get a greenhouse for Emma.
Yes, thank you especially for that.
Next week on the podcast, we are heading to Reno, Nevada. And as regular listeners know, we're huge fans of garden-based learning, and there's a really cool urban teaching farm there that we'll explore.
And in the meantime, you can always connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under the handle Food Garden Life, and me. You can find me on Instagram under @EmmaBiggs_grows. And we'd love to hear your feedback. Are we doing things right? What do you want to hear on the show? Please let us know at foodgardenlife.com.
And if you could do us a favor, if you listen to the podcasts on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, Spotify, Google, subscribe. And if you like what we do, can you rate and review us? Because that really helps us. You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show. I'm Stephen Biggs.
And I'm Emma Biggs. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great month, everyone.
Listening to the Food Garden Life Show with your hosts Stephen and Emma Biggs, right here on Reality Radio 101.